Okay, so a lot of really interesting information, really important information, which we talked about over the last, I think, 20, 25 minutes. Let's move on, right? I think we've covered a lot of the application process. Here's something that happens, I think, after the application is the interview process. We've heard a lot about it, right? Probably one of the most talked about aspects of the entire application. So how does it work? What's going on there?
Awesome. Yes, that is true. A lot of people find this very scary. It's called the MMI or multi-mini interview. Now, different universities actually use different methods of interviewing. Some of them have one-on-one, like face-to-face interview. Some of them have like a panel interview. And then you have the traditional MMI, where you're basically going through multiple stations and you're evaluated on completely different skill sets. So you know how we spoke about how in the US you have a lengthier process, the activity list, you have the CV, you have a lot of other information. And here you just have a personal statement. But this is exactly where you want to showcase everything that you've done. You want to use examples about doctor shadowing, about observerships that you've done, volunteering, etc. So interviews can be very, very interesting and very scary as well. But this is basically your second step of elimination.
Second step of elimination.
And the final one would obviously be because you get a conditional offer from most universities, so
Right.
it will depend on the final grades that you get from high school.
So three elimination steps: your academics, your interviews, and your final grades you get from
Yes.
high school. All right, great. So the process we talked about so far, everything to do with academics, the entrance requirements, extracurriculars, I think, letters of recommendation, and now the interview, the five major steps, I think, in my opinion. And is this the exact same thing for each country we apply to? Like, how does this process vary if you're going to maybe Europe or we go to the US, for
So
example?
in most cases, it is the exact same process, actually. Yeah, most of them do have an interview stage as well.
Most of them do have the interview stage, all right. So we can prepare in a similar way for all the
Yes,
countries.
yes, you can.
That's really interesting to hear. And kind of moving on, right? And this is another question that I think a lot of people will be interested in is how does the relative prestige of a university matter when we're looking at going there for med school? Because there's a lot of hype around like these Harvards and Stanfords and Oxfords and Cambridges of our age, and people think that these are the places you have to go to become a success at whatever you want to be.
Yeah.
And it's no different for medicine, I think. If you want to be the best doctor, you go to Cambridge or Oxford. So, coming from an experienced counselor like yourself, what's your view on this? Like, do you really think that going to a higher ranked university will actually guarantee success moving on in your career?
That's a very interesting question. Let me ask you a question instead.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to a hospital and you meet a doctor, do you ever wonder where they studied from or which university they were from?
Not really, no.
Exactly. So when we talk about med schools, it's more about the accreditation and the approval. So for example, in UK, you have something called the GMC, which is a General Medical Council, which basically approves and accredits universities, and that's all that matters. So long as you're able to get into a GMC approved uni, we're good to go. It doesn't matter whether it's an Oxford or whether it is an Aston or a Buckingham or a Queen's University Belfast. It doesn't really matter at all.
That's actually really good news for a lot of people who really want to get into high rank universities. You don't really need to get into a high rank university to be a success at whatever you're trying to do. And I think I can assume the same thing applies to like graduate schools as well, not just for undergrad degrees. Like if you want to go into a high rank graduate school, does that matter?
Again, very interesting question about graduate school for medicine. Now, do you mean by progression and the master's in medicine?
I think, yeah, something like that. Because we haven't really discussed what do we do after we go on to the undergraduate degree.
Correct.
What goes on before you become an actual doctor? Like, there's a big difference between doing an undergrad and actually becoming a doctor. So what are the steps involved before you reach those two?
Right. So your MBBS degree, like I said, is about 5 to 6 years long.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you will join the NHS, which is the National Health Services in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
If you study in the UK, that is. I'm presuming that's usually the most preferred destination, so I'm just describing more in detail about that.
Got it.
But you do that for a couple of years where you're basically going through different specialties, kind of deciding exactly what you want to finalize on. And then you apply for your core training. Now, the core training is where you are matched with a mentor. You undergo the training process, you're learning on the job. So you're a fully paid employee. There is no tuition fee that you pay. And as and when you're ready, you sit for the certification exams. And that's how you proceed. And that's how you become a specialist.
and then you actually embark on your career as a doctor, right? After you become a specialist, and then you go on to maybe practicing in clinics or maybe starting your
No.
own.
So even before that, actually, when you join the NHS is when you start with the practice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you are a doctor, you're a junior doctor, and you're working, and you're qualified to be a general practitioner at that stage. But once you finish your core training is when you become a specialist or a consultant.
And then like you're an actual like specialist doctor.
Mm-hmm.
All right, really cool. So I think now we're coming on to the meat. One of the biggest factors that go into choosing a med school is obviously money, right? A lot of families have a lot of different financial situations, and a lot of students have different aims to go to when it comes to money and when it comes to actually paying for med school. And I think it's a well-known fact that going to a med school is a lot more expensive than going to a normal school like for college, right? So how can families better plan how they're going to pay for med school? What should be the factors that they should take into consideration when they're trying to pick the right med school for them? And are there any means that families can actually reduce the cost of going to med school?
I think that's again a very interesting question and very important actually. That a lot of people don't often plan for their finances, and it is super important that they start planning on early.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, by the time the student gets to high school, like in grade 9, is when families should ideally decide exactly what kind of budget can we look at. Should we look at maybe student loans? Is there a possibility of scholarship? Because unfortunately, a lot of these universities do not offer scholarships for medicine programs. So it is important that we are aware of the cost that is involved and the additional costs, like the living expenses, maybe even purchase of equipment like stethoscope, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
which has to be borne by the student as well. So it is very important that you plan for all of these way before so that med school does not become a huge burden. However, one thing that we should remember is that this is an investment into your education, and it is a 5 or 6 year long program only, following which, like I said, the master's courses are absolutely free of cost, and you're only bearing the exam fees. So, keeping that in mind, whereas if you were looking at any other major, let's say you're doing an engineering program and you would proceed into a master's, you will be paying the fees for the full duration of that course. Right. Whereas med school is 5 or 6 years, and then we're good to go.
That's fantastic. All right, so that makes a lot of sense. And I think another question related to the first one about financial planning, etc. How does it link back to what med schools you're actually applying to, what countries you're actually applying to? How does the field of play for financial planning and the actual cost of med school change with the countries and the med schools we apply to? Like, what would you recommend to a student who has limited financial resources and who wants to study at a med school? What are the best options for such a student?
I would say that with a limited budget, we should look at options in Europe,
Mm-hmm.
which are fairly reasonable, honestly speaking. It's almost 1/3 of what you would probably spend in other developed countries. So, Europe is a fantastic option. You could also look at combination programs. So, there are a lot of universities with satellite campuses in countries like Malaysia, etc. So these are also options that students can explore where you spend about, let's say, 3 years in Malaysia and then the next 3 years either in the UK or in Ireland. So there are a lot of really interesting programs that I think it's really just about exploring and finding out those details. You'd be surprised with the amount of options that students have.
That's incredible. So there's a lot of really useful tips you gave us to actually plan our finances, right? And talking about another class of students who I've actually met in real life, going back to the first thing we talked about in the first podcast about the actual passion and the actual dedication in applying to med school, a lot of students don't really have that, right? And they need some time to kind of explore whether they actually want to do medicine as a career or not. And I've met a lot of these students in my own experience. So a lot of them are thinking about taking gap years as an option to maybe kind of explore further about whether they like medicine, whether they want to do it, maybe do some actual real work experience like doctor shadowing. So how does a gap year go about for medicine? Like how do you reapply? How do you do a gap year? Is there anything else that you need to keep in mind if you want to take a gap year?
Well, a gap year is not something that's negative. It's perfectly okay for students to be confused and to take a gap year. I think it really is about, finding what you're passionate about, like you rightly said. So if if it means taking, 5 or 6 months extra to explore and figure out if this is the right path for you, go for it, I would say. It's important to utilize the gap year well. I think that's what's most important. Instead of whiling away time, it really is important that you get some work experience, you do some additional courses to kind of support and help you identify what you would like.
Okay.
And then we can apply. There is no harm in taking a gap year if required.
So is a gap year actually an asset for students who want to like boost up their profile before they go into the application season a second time?
I would say it's a boon for students who are unsure. For example, there are a lot of students who presume that the applications go out after your grade 12, right? So
Right.
that they would wait until the exams are done. They're like, okay, now I'm ready to apply, because that's the norm in a lot of other countries. So they don't realize that they've actually missed the deadlines, because in most of these countries, the applications actually go out almost 10 months in advance.
Wow.
So it's like you have to plan when you're in grade 11 to submit your applications, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that a lot of people are not prepared for. And in those cases, yes, a gap year is something that you can definitely consider.
Got it. And kind of building on what you just said right now about people who aren't really aware of the deadlines, or maybe people who start late and don't have the knowledge of the actual process. For example, a student who starts in grade 10 or 11 instead of grade 9, right, and doesn't have that kind of time to build up the profile that he or she needs to get into the best college possible. Now we're sitting in August of this year, and I think the application process starts somewhere in October or November of this year. Over these next 2 or 3 months, what would you advise a potential applicant to do to kind of like put themselves in the best position possible to apply?
I think that's a pretty tough question for me to answer. Can I just say come to us?
Wow, okay, that's
Like
an
we can
option.
guide you with whatever possible ways we can. And I think it really is about us being able to help you showcase the things that you've done. I think a lot of times students don't realize that they have done so many different things. And that's usually why one of my biggest tips is if you're in high school, start making notes of things that you've done. Every single thing matters.
So by things, what do you mean by things? I mean, like a lot of things we do, we don't really consider that to be important in our lives. For example, maybe you go out and play sports, right? And we think that it's a thing that we usually do for like years on end, and we don't really think it's really important for college apps. So when you say that everything is important,
Yeah.
how can everything be important? I mean, it's a difficult concept to wrap our head around.
True. So start maintaining a CV actually, and like you rightly said, keep track of everything. A sport that you play, anything to do with art, anything to do with music, drama, anything that you've been a part of, anything and everything is relevant. And your counselors can kind of help you pick up what is relevant to your application and drop what is not.
Got it. Okay, so a lot of really interesting points you covered throughout our talk. And I think one of the last points I wanted to make, if there's this applicant, right, who hasn't, for example, been able to get the best application out, maybe the applicant hasn't had the grades or the extracurriculars or the best of interviews, for example, and by some unfortunate like mishap has not gotten accepted to the med school that he or she would actually like to go to, and now they're maybe in the last year of school with no options to go into in the future. What opens up for them? Like, do they just give up on their dream or something, or what happens for them?
Keep dreaming. You should never give up on your dreams. I think you want to assess as to why we did not get through to university, though. Is it academics? Is it maybe the interview performance? Was it the entrance exam? I think we kind of analyze that and remedy that. If it is an academic issue, then you probably want to resit these exams. If it is an interview performance, then you definitely may want to consider taking a gap year and then reapplying, etc. I think again, like I said, it really is about assessing why we did not get through and then remedying that action. And that does not mean the end of the world or the end of your dreams.
Got it. So you talked about reapplying right now. So how do you reapply? What's the reapplication process like for people who have already applied to college for 1 year?
It is
It's
exactly
exactly
the
the
same.
same.
Yeah, it's exactly the same as a fresh application.
So there will be absolutely no changes whatsoever. Like in terms, obviously you can improve your application to be a better match for the schools you want to go
Yeah.
to. But apart from that, there's nothing that changes for a person who's taking a gap year or
No.
who's reapplying.
No.
All right, that's actually incredible. So thanks so much. I think we've covered a lot of the questions that I've had, and I've learned a lot from this. So thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm glad that we were able to answer majority of the questions, if not all. But if you have any further questions regarding the medical applications, on deciding your career progression, or even, how do I prepare for interviews? How do I prepare for UCAT? Any questions that you may have, feel free to reach out to us. Drop your questions on the comment box, and like and share our channel if you enjoyed this. Thank you.